forbidden burnt offering. Happy New Year, folks! While we were making toasts to loved ones, grateful that we all made it into the new year, a dangerous cartel kingpin in Mexico named El Neto pulled off a prison break so brazen that it sparked a national incident and lives were lost in the process. In this video, I will show you who he is, who he was, and exactly how his prison escape went down. Who is the most ruthless kingpin in the history of the drug trade? If your answer is Pablo, you are wrong. Despite his brutality, Escobar was at least a man you could reason with, and at the very least, a man who had maintained a level of stability in his home city of Medellin. Now, if your answer is El Chapo, I hate to break it to you once again, but you are incorrect. For all the escapist Sinaloan drug lord's ruthlessness, his sons have proven to have a larger appetite for violence than their father. The most ruthless drug lord in history, and at the moment, is believed to be the fearsome El Mencho, the diabolical boss of the world's most diabolical cartel, CJNG. El Mencho needs very little introduction. We are talking about a drug lord who was the first to take the battle to the doorstep of the Mexican military and the only one so far to threaten a sitting attorney general by sending him the severed head of a pig. He even triggered a terrorist-level event in the city of Guadalajara to facilitate his own escape. That is all the introduction you need as proof of ruthlessness. And in the years since, most people were sure that no one could outdo him. We were certain that there wouldn't be anyone worse than El Mencho. But as it appears, we were a little short-sighted because the violence that El Mencho began in his 30s to put his cartel on the map, El Neto had already accomplished before he even turned 18. Ernesto El Neto Piñón is what one would consider a cartel prodigy. If we rank drug lords by their lowering degrees of lack of empathy, El Neto would be at the top, ranked above El Mencho. And I'm going to tell you why in a moment. Born in the state of Chihuahua, Mexico, 1989, El Neto's early years are a mystery. However, we know that by the time he turned 18, El Neto had been a drug kingpin long enough to be considered a serious threat to the peace of the entire state of Chihuahua, and more specifically, the bustling city of Ciudad Juarez. He was in charge of one of the most fearsome street gangs, and he led a wave of robberies, kidnappings, and gruesome killings that shocked everyone. The teenage kingpin's method of warning his rival gangs was by sending the heads of their members in ice coolers. His reputation eventually earned him a role with the Sinaloa cartel as an enforcer, and it is believed that he worked very closely with El Chapo at some point. This affiliation and his subsequent reputation wasn't lost on the police or the state, and it didn't take long for them to decide that the teenage crime boss was a problem. Eventually, El Neto was arrested in 2009. His sentencing was scheduled for 2010, but those who captured him didn't realize he wasn't the one who needed to be kept in prison. It was the prison system that needed to be kept away from him. The police had no idea what they were getting into when they captured El Neto, and you cannot blame them. An 18-year-old kingpin doesn't exactly inspire the kind of dread that one associates with cartel heavyweights, but they almost paid for it back in 2010, because despite his age, El Neto had managed to inspire a cultish level of loyalty in his men, a loyalty that was on the level of the Sinaloa cartel members who had colluded to free El Chapo twice. On that fateful day in 2010, El Neto was on his way from prison to a sentencing hearing at Chihuahua's State General Attorney's Office. He was heavily guarded by the police and was bound to receive a 200-year sentence for kidnapping. All of a sudden, an armed group blocked the government vehicle at a roundabout and began a shootout to rescue El Neto that lasted for hours. The plot failed and El Neto lost his right eye in the process, transforming the kingpin from a babyface killer to a monster with looks that were consistent with his brutish nature. But the lesson here wasn't learned, at least not on the part of the government. They hadn't learned that El Neto wasn't the kind of killer you throw into a prison's general population. El Neto was a leader. He was the kind of guy that people levitated towards, the kind that people would want to follow. So when he was sent to Cerezo No. 3 State Prison, a penitentiary that sat on the borders of Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, Texas, a prison that had a history of violence and prison riots, a prison that was overpopulated and overrun by prison gangs, it reflected the point I made much earlier. The government still has a lesson to learn. And unfortunately for the citizens of Ciudad Juarez, they were the ones who would pay the price. In February 2016, Pope Francis paid a visit to El Neto's prison.
Pope Francis visited a Mexican prison during his last full day in the country. The prison is in Ciudad Juarez, which borders El Paso, Texas. The visit is very symbolic because the site represents a series of social problems Mexico faces.
One of the many reasons for the Pope's visit was a devastating prison riot that had happened some weeks before and had left 3 inmates dead. Unsurprisingly, El Neto was at the center of this prison riot. He was just 27 at the time and had already served more than 5 years behind bars. One can imagine he was present amongst the thousands of inmates who listened to the Pope give a sermon about peace, reconciliation, and faith. But the Pope's sermon was for lost souls, and El Neto had no soul to lose. Because 5 years before this papal visit, immediately after El Neto got into prison, the young anarchist had allied himself with the leader of a street gang known as Los Mesicles, Juan Eduardo Soto, aka El Lalo. Like Neto, El Lalo was also young, brutal, and a proven leader. El Lalo also happened to be an agent of chaos. He ran the prison with an iron fist, and along with El Neto, caused so much violence within prison walls that it spilled into the city around them. A year after Pope Francis's visit, El Neto was at the forefront of another prison riot against a rival gang called Los Aztecas in 2017. This riot led to the death of 17 people. In 2019, the duo sparked another prison riot, and the death toll almost doubled. 26 people lost their lives. Meanwhile, members of Los Mesicles outside the cell allied with the Sinaloa cartel and became their enforcers. And it was at this point that the authorities began to see how much of a problem both El Lalo and El Neto had become. So what was their solution? Well, same old, same old. The divide and conquer technique. They took out the head, transferring El Lalo from the state prison he was in to a federal prison, the Federal Center for Social Readaptation, Cefareso, number 15, located in Villa Camatitlan, Chiapas in February 2020. By now, you should know that removing the head of a gang or cartel will lead to either of two eventualities: unbridled chaos as the cartel or gang splinters and tries to find stability, or a fiercer, more ruthless head takes control and creates a worse situation than his predecessor. In this case, the latter happened. El Neto took control of the cartel. He immediately began expanding Los Mesicles. Deportees or returnees from the U.S. were enlisted, and soon the city of Ciudad Juarez descended into a new age of violence that I imagine no one saw coming.
Our top story tonight, terror in Juarez. Several acts of violence have our sister city on high alert tonight. Many of the attacks have been against convenience stores and gas stations. They all happened around the same time this afternoon, right after a deadly fight inside a Juarez prison.
In August 2021, the city of Ciudad Juarez felt the wrath of inmates and gang members loyal to El Neto. The government had realized their mistake many years too little late, and in an effort to reduce the cycle of riots and violence that El Neto had instigated, they made preparations to send him to a federal prison, as they had done with El Lalo. Unfortunately, it worsened the entire situation. Somehow, information leaked, and El Neto, along with his loyalists, triggered a prison riot. At first, they took advantage of prison visiting hours to launch the attack, forcing authorities to be in a more vulnerable position. As visiting civilians panicked and fled to safety, some 24 inmates were able to blend into the crowd and escape. 2 inmates died and 20 were wounded in the ensuing chaos, but the violence was far from over. In fact, it bled into the city that night, and that led to its own casualties. As gang members set buses on fire, late-night stores that were often spared the violence found themselves under direct assault as gang members looted and assaulted both employees and customers. A pregnant woman was burnt alive at a convenience store that was set ablaze. Another 4 members of a radio station crew working remotely from a pizza shop were shot dead. 2 other men were also shot dead, and a child was killed. These random acts of violence were devastating, but unfortunately, they were effective. With 11 people dead by Friday morning, hundreds of police officers and soldiers patrolled the streets to restore order, and plans to transfer El Neto were shelved. But El Neto knew, probably more than anyone, that the war wasn't over. It was only a matter of time before he would be transferred. And before that would happen, El Neto began to plot what has now become one of the most brutal assaults on a Mexican state prison system. The script was the same as the last. 1st of January 2023, New Year's Day, a day when visitors came visiting their loved ones who were incarcerated within the cells. The attack began around 9 in the morning. The moment those doors were open for visitors, the chaos began. And boy, was it coordinated. Within prison walls, El Neto led his men to set objects and cells on fire. 10 guards were held hostage as the drug kingpin battled his way to the exit. Meanwhile, Sinaloa cartel vehicles and armed vehicles stormed the prison from the exterior, crashed through the prison gates, and began taking out the guards guards on security towers from the inside. As the prison authorities became overwhelmed by the attack on both sides, El Neto ordered the 10 guards he had taken hostage to be executed, and he, along with 10 other men, escaped. But it wasn't over. In fact, it was far from over. The prison escape led to a chase. A vehicle was seized. A Hummer vehicle belonging to the criminals was wrecked, but El Neto was nowhere to be found. He had escaped. His plan had worked to perfection. As the Mexican government tried to avoid what could easily become another Black Thursday, some gang members outside prison gates took advantage of the situation and tried to set the city alight once again. But citizens were more alert, and most, if not everyone, did their best to remain indoors. In the wake of his escape, the government of Chihuahua devoted everything to 3 agendas. One was to secure the perimeter of the prison and ensure stability was restored. The second was to secure the city of Ciudad Juarez and ensure it didn't succumb to the brooding violence. And the third required El Neto getting captured, dead or alive. But it wasn't going to be easy because, as with most things involving the cartel and its players, the public realized just how political the affair had become. El Neto's prison cell was raided by authorities, and they discovered that the man, along with some other high-level gang members, had been living like Arab princes. Authorities found over $87,000 in cash and a large variety of drugs, including 4 kilograms of crystal meth, 40 grams of cocaine, 16.2 kilograms of marijuana, 1.5 kilograms of heroin, and 8 fentanyl pills. There was a jacuzzi in his prison cell. Corruption had eaten deep into the prison, and that's why it was so susceptible to riots. The prison director, Alejandro Alvarado Tellez, was fired, and an internal investigation was conducted to determine the nature and level of his involvement in the incident that led to El Neto's escape. But this is where things get messier. Alejandro hadn't spent up to a year as the prison director. In fact, he had been transferred from another prison to take the reins of leadership after the former director was handed the sack in the aftermath of Black Thursday. So it's very possible he wasn't the one who provided El Neto and his accomplices with the liberties they enjoyed during their stay. But thankfully, there was some good news. The Chihuahua State Governor, Maru Campos, released this tweet on the 5th of January. I am informed that during the early hours of this Thursday, thanks to the intelligence team of the state prosecutor's office and in coordination with the 3 orders of government, El Neto was located, persecuted, was injured, but on the way, lost his life. Apparently, earlier that day, they located, hunted down, and injured El Neto, who allegedly rammed his vehicle into a gas station as he attempted to flee the authorities. The injury proved to be fatal, and he lost his life while they were carrying him in the back of a truck on his way to the state prosecutor's office. But you remember what I said earlier about cutting off the head of a criminal organization, and there will always be another one. So while the city of Ciudad Juarez can now breathe a sigh of relief, they'd be the first to tell you that it is only momentary. There will soon be another El Neto, and the only thing they can do for now is breathe